Well, in Matthew chapter 26 today, picking up where we left off last Sunday, if you want to turn there with me, we're going to be picking up in verse 57 today. Where we had left off last time was when Jesus had instituted the Lord's Supper with his disciples as they were partaking of the Passover. And then Judas had gone out and betrayed Jesus, and Jesus is telling Peter and the rest of the disciples that were there with him in the Garden of Gethsemane, or there as they went up in the Mount of Olives, that they were going to be scattered like sheep when Jesus, the shepherd, would be struck. And Peter denied it. Peter, said, no, that's not going to happen. And the other disciples were saying the same thing. Oh, we're not going to leave you, Jesus. And then we see Jesus' prayer in the garden, and he knows his time is near, and Judas does come up and leads the mob to Jesus, and they arrest Jesus. And it is then, as we pick up in Matthew 26, verse 57 today, that we see what happens next after Jesus has been falsely arrested. Jesus had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for Jesus to be arrested. There was no reason for Jesus to stand trial. There was no reason for this mob to come out against Jesus with clubs and weapons and all kinds of things as if he was some kind of criminal. Even as he said there in verse 55, but he knows the scriptures must be fulfilled. And now, notice at the end of verse 56 that what happened was exactly what Jesus said was going to happen. All the disciples forsook Jesus and fled. It is then that verse 57, those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter, we notice, followed Jesus at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end, to see what would happen. So Peter, along with the other disciples, they scatter away from Jesus, but Peter kind of tags along at a distance so that he can see what's going to happen to Jesus. Now the chief priests, notice this, the chief priests in verse 59, and the elders, all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. They couldn't find any. Even though we find that it says, verse 60, many false witnesses came forward, they found none. They found nothing. So basically, these Jewish leaders, they just want Jesus dead, and so they're willing to come, if they can find some false witnesses, find some false charges, something that they think they can twist and make work against Jesus, they'll do it. But they're having a hard time. But even though a lot of false witnesses came forward, they couldn't find what they thought would actually work. But at last, 2 false witnesses came forward. And they said, verse 61, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. And so really, they are twisting some words, a point that Jesus made before, and Jesus talking about the temple, Jesus talking about his bodily resurrection. But here they turn it into, Jesus went around saying that Jesus was claiming he was going to destroy the temple of God and he could build it again in 3 days. And so the high priest arose and said to Jesus, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent. So here's Jesus before the Sanhedrin. He's been arrested. All these false charges are being brought up against Jesus, and he's not saying a word. Jesus knows they're not true, but Jesus knows what's happening. Jesus knows why he's there. Jesus knows what needs to happen. And even as Isaiah prophesied in Isaiah 53 that as a lamb before its shearers is silenced, so he opened not his mouth. Jesus was not fighting this because he knew what needed to be done. And so the high priest answered and said to Jesus, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. So they want him to just straight out tell them whether or not he is the Christ, the Son of God. And so he says to him, verse 64, it is as you said. So really affirming, confirming that that is true. He is the Christ. He is the Son of God. But Jesus went on to say, nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power of God and coming on the clouds of heaven. And so Jesus told them what was going to happen, of his glory, of his exaltation, of his power, of his authority. Them seeing the Son of Man coming in power and on clouds. And so the high priest tore his robes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered and said, he is deserving of death. So they asked Jesus, are you the Christ? Are you the Son of God? And he tells them the truth. He says, yes, he is the Son of God. He is the Christ. Well, they now charge him with blasphemy because they do not believe that he is the Christ. They do not believe that he is the Son of God. And so they want to put him to death. In verse 67, then they spat in his face and they beat him. And others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you? Some, or the other gospel accounts tell us that Jesus was actually blindfolded. And so they're making fun of him. They're mocking him. They're, saying that if you really are the Christ and you can do these things and know these things and have the power of God, well, you can tell us who struck you, who hit you. And they're spitting on him. They're beating him. What awful things they're doing to Jesus. Jesus being falsely arrested, falsely accused. Now when he tells the truth about being the Christ, the Son of God, they ridicule him, mock him, beat him, spit on him. And all along, verse 69, Peter is nearby, still at a distance. Peter sat outside in the courtyard. And as Peter is out there in the courtyard, keeping his distance, wanting to know what's happening, but still trying to hide, a servant girl came to Peter and said, you also were with Jesus of Galilee. But Peter denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you were talking about. I do not know what you were saying. Remember, Jesus told Peter earlier that he was going to deny him, that Peter was going to deny Jesus. Peter said, no, that's not going to happen. Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you, back in verse 35. But Jesus had told him, verse 34, that I say this night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Here's number 1. So here's the test for Peter. Peter said he committed himself to Jesus. He committed himself to the Lord, said, no, I'm not going to deny you. But here when he is finally tested and a servant girl asks him, he denies knowing Jesus. And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, this fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth. But again Peter denied it with an oath this time, saying, I do not know the man. And a little later those who stood by came up and said to Peter, surely you also are one of them, for your speech betrays you. Then Peter began to curse and swear, saying, I do not know the man. That was the 3rd time. And immediately a rooster crowed. Peter's faith and Peter's willingness to suffer and die with Jesus as he said he would, is now tested, and he fails. 3 times he has denied Jesus, just as Jesus said he would. The rooster crows, and Peter, verse 75, Peter remembered the word of Jesus who had said to him, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And so naturally, Peter goes out and cries bitterly. One at you, one at I. Knowing the promises we made, if we were Peter, to Jesus, and the faith and the confidence we showed, the boldness, but now that we've been put in the test, if we were to deny Jesus, Peter, one of the most faithful, diligent, zealous, closest to Jesus, has now denied Jesus 3 times. And so Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. Can't imagine the guilt and the pain and the sorrow. Can't imagine what was going through his mind and his heart. Even one of the gospel accounts tells us that he locked eyes with Jesus after this, and can't imagine having denied Jesus and then looking Jesus in the face. So right now, Peter's feeling all of that. Peter's feeling all the guilt and shame, and runs off and weeps bitterly. And then continuing into chapter 27, when morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. They wanted to figure out how they could get to the point of having him executed. And when they had bound Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. So now they know they need to get Jesus into the hands of the Roman authorities so that they can have him crucified. Now the camera changes to another character, another disciple that we had talked about, Judas Iscariot, who had already betrayed Jesus. And Judas, Jesus' betrayer, seeing that Jesus had been condemned, that Jesus was going to die. This Judas who had betrayed Jesus now was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Now Judas is hit with his guilt, his shame. He sees what he has done wrong, and maybe he didn't mean it to go this far. Whatever the case may have been for Judas, now he regrets it. He's remorseful. He brings back the money. He wants nothing to do with this. He wants them to let Jesus go. Or at least would hope so. But they said to Judas, what is that to us? You see to it. They don't care. At this point, the elders, the priests, they don't care. Then Judas threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. Judas was so overcome with shame and guilt and grief for what he had done to Jesus and betraying him, and now Jesus is going to be put to death. Or at least that's what they're going to try to do. Judas had a change of heart. Judas realized what he did wrong. He was remorseful. He tried to make it right, and it didn't work, at least with the Jews. And sadly and unfortunately, Judas decided to take his own life. But the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, it is not lawful to put them into the treasury because they are the price of blood. It's like, oh, really? Now they want to do, what is right and good and holy. And, we can't put this money in the treasury. It's blood money. And they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Prophecy of Jeremiah being fulfilled. And Judas betraying Jesus, regretting it, trying to take this money back. The Jews don't want this money, so they find a way to use the money, get rid of the money, so they buy this field to bury strangers in. Truly the field of blood, as it is called, and fulfills this prophecy so long ago of Jeremiah. They put a price on Jesus. They put a price on the Messiah. And so now we see Jesus in the grips of mankind and their evil and their hatred. And next week, Lord willing, we'll see what happens next and talk about it. But notice as well that as Jesus is now facing unlawful, unfair trials by the Jews and then going to by the Romans. But now two disciples in particular, Peter ends up denying Jesus. Judas had already betrayed Jesus. Now Judas did want to try to make it right, but it didn't work out how he thought it would, and sadly he took his life. Peter, we'll see what happens with him later. But some sad, hard things happening leading up to the death of Jesus by the very disciples of Jesus. But now Jesus is facing these trials, being falsely accused. They're wanting to put Jesus to death. Jesus being mocked and spat upon, being mistreated, being ridiculed. Jesus who did nothing wrong. Jesus who committed no sin, committed no crime. This is just pure and utter hatred of mankind that they are showing towards Jesus. And next week we'll pick up and see what happens with Jesus as he faces the Roman authorities and what took place during all of that. Let's remember Jesus. Let's remember all this that he went through, all that happened to Jesus. Remember why he did it, why he went through it, why he was willing to. As he had told Peter earlier in the garden when he was first betrayed, and Peter tried to step in, Jesus said, "Don't you know that I could petition the Father, I could ask, and he would send legions, thousands of angels." But Jesus didn't do that. Jesus was willing to go through all of this because he knew it would lead to our salvation. Think on these things. Remember Jesus. Remember what he went through. And give thanks to God. God bless.